In any relationship, we want to feel engaged, we want to feel connected, we want to feel respected. In the world of work, the phrase employee engagement is really high profile at the moment, and in fact it's quite frightening when you look at the statistics on how engaged people feel they are. Most of us don't feel listened to, we don't feel we have a connection, and we don't feel respected much of the time. And one of the challenges in the giving of feedback is that basic premise that people are often threatened by the notion of feedback. Many people are threatened by giving it, and certainly, as I alluded to before, neuroscience has suggested that when people hear the words, "I would like to give you some feedback," their threat response is triggered. And fundamentally, we have two basic psychological responses based around threat and reward. Now, if our threat response is triggered, we tend to focus only on what's happening and how to survive in that particular moment. Effectively, it's our fight and flight kicking in. And so if you're feeding back to somebody in an unprofessional way or in an appropriate way, it is highly likely that you will trigger their threat response. And as a consequence of that, they're very unlikely to take in the information and act on it in the way that you might hope. Now, on the other side, of course, if you're able to trigger the reward response, then we like being rewarded. Our focus is very much in the moment on maximizing the value from that reward, but also we then tend to look forward to how we can maintain that going forward. So in essence, if you are triggering somebody's threat response when you're giving feedback, effectively they are disengaging from the conversation. They're only thinking about survival in the moment. Whereas if you can trigger the reward response, then they are engaging. Not only are they focusing on what you're saying in the moment, but they're thinking about how they can take that thing forward. And interestingly, you can have a reward response triggered by some sometimes quite difficult and challenging feedback. So it's not about the content so much as the way that the content is being delivered. Now, you may have come across a thing called the feedback sandwich. Now, please forgive me, I've always been a little bit cynical about the feedback sandwich, and it's the notion, certainly in the world of business, but equally it would apply in personal relationships, where you have feedback to give to somebody, particularly when you have a more challenging, difficult message you want to give to somebody, that you open up with some positive feedback. You then go into the more challenging feedback, but you have a more upbeat reward bit of feedback at the end. Now, the notion is a really good one. Don't get me wrong. We've already said if you're triggering that reward response up front, then people are likely to engage. They're likely to be more receptive to the more challenging feedback and continue that engagement as you end up. My challenge is that so often it's done as a real process, and actually people aren't stupid and they see through it and they end up feeling manipulated rather than engaged. And so ironically, what turns out to be triggering is the threat response rather than the reward response. So the real challenge is to think about avoiding the threat response as much as you possibly can and triggering the reward response. So that may be through giving some positive strokes and feedback at the beginning of a conversation. But when you're delivering more challenging messages, if indeed it is a more challenging message you have to deliver, then making sure that you are keeping it to your opinion, positioning things very clearly, being very precise and ambiguous in your words, having evidence to back up your view, it's only your view, and all the things that we've talked about. And focusing then on how that can benefit the person moving forward. That will keep things more focused on the reward response. So when giving feedback, think carefully about whether you are inadvertently triggering someone's threat response or their reward response. If you are making statements, if you're making accusations, if you're positioning your view as a fact, it will start to feel a little more confrontational, and inevitably, therefore, it will trigger the threat response, and people's first response is to build the defensive wall and then try and get out of there. What they won't do is engage.